webinar.
Thank you.
This webinar is organized by the John Paul II Center for Interreligious Dialogue, together with the Institute of Religion and Society of the Ukrainian Catholic University, and together with the Libertas Center for Interreligious Dialogue. The theme of the webinar is Monotheism in the Hebrew Bible and its implications for interreligious dialogue. Today's speaker is Rabbi Jack Bemporad. Most of you know Rabbi Jack Bemporad, but I'll just say a few words about Rabbi Jack. Rabbi Jack is an extraordinary human being. He's a professor of Judaism. He's a rabbi. He taught interreligious dialogue in the Vatican, in a Catholic institution, for more than 60 years, I believe now, right, Rabbi Jack? And actually,
at the Angelicum, 20 years, yeah.
In the Vatican, oftentimes they refer to him as Father Rabbi. It's a great pleasure to have you with us, Rabbi Jack, and thanks so much for accepting this invitation. So, Rabbi Jack, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Well, Taras, first of all, I can't thank you enough. I go back a long way with you. When I first was introduced to you from Father Williams, who is a great hero of mine. I know he's a great hero of yours. I mean, there's no better and finer human being or more learned human being. And he said to me, take good care of my student Taras, because he's the best I have. And then I discovered that not only was he the best that he had, but the best that I had. So between the two of us, we're very, very pleased with Taras. Taras is just wonderful. And everything you've done since you got your doctorate, I must say, you've earned our respect and our esteem and our thanks for this wonderful work that you're doing. So thank you. And also thank you for that very kind introduction. Let me just say that the approach that I'm going to take this morning on the issue of monotheism is going to be basically untraditional, because I don't want to do it in a way that everybody else does it. I'd rather, and by the way I did it in this paper that Taras will be sending to you, I wanted to really start with the fact that in the ancient world, in all of the ancient world, there was only one place that everyone even remotely dreamed of the possibility of peace as a historical reality. You have this in Isaiah where it says, you know, that they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, nor study war or be accustomed to war anymore. And Micah has the very same passages in the 4th chapter of the book, and he concludes, but each individual shall sit under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid. I think it would be helpful if we were to ask the question, why is that the case? Why is it that the closest parallel that you have to this messianic concept in the Bible is Plato? Plato, as you probably know, in the Republic, has this conception of the ideal state. By the way, a state that Plato himself says is only real in words. It will never be real in reality. But this ideal state, as ideal, has 3 basic classes. It has governors, it has soldiers, and it has workers. It was inconceivable to Plato that you could have a society without war. It was inconceivable that you could have a society without soldiers. And I remember when I came to Italy, the first ship that left the United States, and I came back to Italy in 46. Basically, we wanted to know who in my family was alive and who was dead. And we landed in Palermo, and every single house was totally destroyed. Totally. I saw young boys and girls naked going through garbage cans looking for something to eat. And it was at that time that I saw the horrors of war, the real horrors, concrete, existential horrors of war. And so what is really interesting to me is, why is it that the Bible is the only book in the ancient world that has a vision of a society that can be a society of peace, a society that categorically rejects and is opposed to war, and that the bringing about peace becomes a continuing task. Now, in the ancient world, and I'm so sorry to say that I think even in the modern world, war is seen as not just a reality, but as a norm. There was no place, there's no peace really. All you have is an uninterrupted war. And even when you had in the First World War, as Wilson spoke about a war to end all wars, not only was it a war to end all wars, as bad as the First World War was, the Second World War was even worse. And then after that, at least from the United States, you had the Korean War, you had the Vietnam War, you have this Iraq War, which we're still involved in. In other words, what we really believe reality was not only a place of peace, but uninterrupted war. Now, the thing that is interesting, this is characteristic especially of Greek civilization. And Greek civilization was built on war. I don't know whether you're aware of the fact that in Sparta, if someone, for example, felt he wasn't enough, and he saw a virile, strong, dominant, ruthless man, he would beg him to have sex with his wife so that he could have children who could be warriors. And why? Because all the virtues were based on war. What are the virtues? What is a vir, a really virtuous man? Someone who, by the way, had no compassion. Compassion, altruism was a vice. Ruthlessness, strength, every kind of control and domination, those were the virtues, you see? All the virtues were built on war. And what you had is an organization of the human being that constantly emphasized those elements that were the elements of battle. It was the elements of preparing to fight. And those elements that were different seemed to have been in the background. See, there was no concept of humanity. The idea of humanity did not exist. You had tribes, you had nations, and you had many, many different tribal and national deities. Monotheism as embodying one world, one historic goal, one created reality, simply didn't exist. The vision that I spoke to you of Isaiah, which is that basically, lo yilmadu od milchama, that they should no longer be accustomed to or learn war. War has to be learned. It's not really natural if you look at the biblical point of view. And so what I'm saying is that this idea that the virtue should not be for war, but for peace was revolutionary. No one thought that. Aristotle in the Politics says that the true courage, listen to this, true courage is when a person gives his life for his city. That Aristotle, who was a philosopher, who wasn't a soldier, basically, who wasn't rooted in war, would say that this is the ideal. Now, if this is the ideal, who's going to talk about peace? Who's going to talk about compassion, kindness, graciousness, patience, love, truth? They would rather talk about cruelty, exploitation. And not only that, war produces lies. If you have war, they say that the first casualty in war is truth. So how can one deal with war and its consequences? Here, I think, the way I personally believe it was the result of revelation, but let's leave that aside for a minute. What you deal with war and its consequences with a whole new concept of God, a new concept of God. God is not a being that is to be propitiated for victory or manipulated with rituals, including sacrifices, in fact, including child sacrifices. Usual in the ancient world that you would sacrifice your child because you had to somehow bribe and propitiate the deity. or through manipulated ritual and sacrifices. You know, when Micah in chapter 6, verses 6 to 9 says, how do I come before God and bow before God on high? Keep in mind, we know that this happened in 701. Jerusalem was surrounded. In fact, if you look at the British Museum, there's a thing there that says, I Hezekiah like a bird in a cage, Sennacherib says. And so they said, how do we bribe and propitiate God? Do we offer him thousands of buckets of oil? Do we offer up our firstborn for our sin, the fruit of our body for the sin of our soul? That was religion. So what was the response that Micah gives? Micah gives this response. It has been told you, O man, what is good, and what God doth require of thee, but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk with humbly. Now it's interesting, the Septuagint, the Greek translation, instead of it says walk with integrity before God. Or what do you do with Leviticus 19? You should become holy, for I, the Lord, your God, am holy. And what does it mean to be holy? What it means to be holy, basically, is to not put a stumbling block before the blind, not to curse the deaf, not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor, but love your neighbor because he is equal to you. And so what I'm saying here is that there's no real attempt in Judaism to say this is the nature of God. In fact, in the one place which is pretty clear, in Exodus 34, I think it's verse 6, where Moses says, show me your glory, show me your real essence. And God says, no human being can really understand my essence, but you can understand my attributes. Now, did it ever occur to you that the attributes that are presented there in the 34th chapter of Exodus are what? I am Rachum, compassionate, Chanun, gracious, Erech Apayim, patient, Rav Chesed, full of steadfast love, and truth. These are the attributes of God. Tell me where in the ancient world you have attributes of God that have anything to do with these virtues. And these are the virtues, incidentally, that we should embody. If God is our creator, if God is a spiritual being that creates us and fashions us and forms us, then we have to embody the very characteristics that he embodies. Now, if that's true, then you can say, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. Did it ever occur to you why it says all your heart, all your soul? Because the worst thing you can do is divide it. So yes, this is for God, but this, after all, is for the idol. This is for God, yes, but this is for the work of my hands, you see. And so what I'm saying in effect is that you had to construct an ethic that confronts the ravages of war. And what are the ravages of war? Let's face it. If you were to look at the ethics of the Hebrew Bible, you have to ask yourself, why do they have this ethic? Why are they concerned with slaves? Why are they concerned with strangers? Why are they concerned with orphans and widows and the poor? Right? Why? Why should they be concerned? Nobody else was. I mean, the slaves were there because you conquered them and you worked them to death. You know, I mean, when the Roman Empire collapsed when there was no longer any more territory to conquer and get slaves so that you can have them and do what you want with them. Do you know that the Sabbath basically was an institution for slaves? When it says, for example, that you should remember or observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, that means keep it precious. And this is a day when you should rest, yes, but not just you. It's not right for you to rest and the slave to work. So it's you and your slave, your female slave, even the stranger, they should rest too. Even the animal should rest. What the Sabbath actually meant was that every human being is in control of his or her time 1 day a week. If you're in control 1 day a week, it means you're no longer an object 24/7. You now all of a sudden are a subject. And if you're a subject, then you can understand that. Why, for example, would they be concerned about strangers? The second thing that you have after war, other than slaves in the ancient world, was strangers. Do you not think that we're going through this now? There are over 74 million refugees right now. How are we going to treat them? Well, the Bible is clear. It says there should be one law for the stranger and for the homeborn. And if a slave runs away in Deuteronomy, he is to be treated like a stranger. He's not to be returned to his master. And why do you think that they're constantly talking about strangers, orphans, and widows? Constantly. By the way, the stranger is referred to 36 times in the Bible, in the Pentateuch. Now, why do you think they combine the orphan, the stranger, and the widow? Because the stranger has no one to protect him. The orphan has no parents. The widow has no husband. So guess what? It's the Torah that protects them. It's the teaching that protects them. And I think that this is exactly the kind of ethic that is needed today. And so the Jews, the Hebrews, were the first to basically reject the concept of the inevitability of war. Now, I'm saying to you that this was impossible unless you had prophets who actually, not wizards or miracle workers or magicians or mediums. Deuteronomy 18, take a look at it, you'll see, categorically rejects that and associates that with child sacrifice. No, you need a prophet who could stand up to kings and princes and priests and false prophets and say, in the name of God. You can't do that. Now, how did this come around? How did we come across this idea that somehow, and for some strange reason, we have to love the vulnerable. We have to have compassion on the powerless. And here I think what you have is something really different. And what is that? Is that the stranger becomes the symbol of man among the nations. And the opposite of one unique God is not many gods. That's not the opposite of one God, unique God, but many peoples. Because what I want to submit to you today is that basically one God means one humanity, and without one God, you have no concept of one humanity. The very idea of one humanity originates with the concept of God. And war is the symbol of a false humanity. That's what war is. Because if we're going to be killing each other and destroying each other and spending most of our money trying to build weapons to destroy one another, that's the symbol of a false humanity. Now, one God is one humanity. War must cease, peace reign. And therefore, for example, God will be one and his name one. And all this is a new concept of religion. And what does it mean to be religious? To be religious basically means that we have to achieve a state which the Bible designated as a time of the Messiah. The concept of the Messiah is only conceivable from the perspective of monotheism. That is, some future leader who will bring peace and justice to the whole world, the Messianic age, the idea of a future humanity. And this idea of a future humanity, the idea of a God who creates the world, guides the world, gives human beings their tasks, and it brings about, therefore, peace. And here I think what one has is some interesting things, because it was a great puzzle. It was a great puzzle. By the way, how much time do I have?
Yeah, you have about 15 more minutes, 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes.
Okay, great. It was a great puzzle to the people who were outside of for example, I'd like to quote Tacitus. Leon Roth wrote a very good chapter called Jewish Thought as a Factor in Civilization. In his book, Is There a Jewish Philosophy, is the name of the book. And he said, the Roman historian, let me quote him, the Roman historian Tacitus said, the Egyptians worship animals of many kinds and images made by men's hands. Their gods are thus understandable. The Jews acknowledge one God only, and they conceive of him by the mind alone. He then goes on to specify further. The Jews condemn as impious all who, with perishable materials wrought into the human shape, form representations of the deity. That being, they say, is above all and eternal, given neither to change or decay. For it was in consequence of this, he continues, that is, the conception of God, that they allow no effigies of him in their cities, much less in their temples. Their kings are not given this flattery, nor the Caesars this honor. Keep in mind that during the Roman period, most of the emperors proclaimed themselves God. And the wars had a lot to do with that. When Antiochus Epiphanes means God manifest, when he made himself a god and made statues of himself and brought the statue in the temple in Jerusalem, they refused to accept it. There was a rebellion, you see. And Philo, who, by the way, was asked to go to Caligula, he went to Caligula because Caligula, who, by the way, was totally nuts, he took his horse and made him Secretary of State. And by the way, it was Caligula that brought back Pontius Pilate and Caiaphas. He brought them back to Rome for cruelty. All you have to do is read Eusebius, the church historian. And here's what Philo of Alexander says. He says, and this is in relationship to Caligula's order to set up a statue of himself in the Temple of Jerusalem. Here's Philo. He says, by their parents and teachers and instructors, and even before that, by their holy teachings, and also by their unwritten maxims and customs, to believe that there was but one God, their Father and the Creator of the world. For all others, all men, all women, all cities, all nations, every country and region of the earth, I had almost said the whole of the inhabited world, although groaning over what was taking place, did not nevertheless flatter Caligula, and some of them even introduced the barbaric custom into Italy of falling down in adoration before him, adulterating their native feelings of Roman liberty. But this single people of the Jews alone refused to perform these actions. I think it's kind of interesting. And you don't even need to read Tacitus or the Romans. You can read Jeremiah. Jeremiah, he says, the gods that have not made the heavens and the earth, these shall perish from the earth and from under the heavens. So that if you look at the Bible, the difference between the God who made you and the God who you make, or the God who you project, or the God who you create, that's the real difference. I mean, Paul says that in his letters. There's a difference between God as creator and the God that we basically create. So to somehow try to summarize, I would say the following: that monotheism implies a spiritual creator God. As long as the gods were forces in nature, that was true of all pre-biblical religion. Then each deity had, I have a question here from Hannah to everyone. Do you see that? Should we continue? Yeah. Should we answer that question? What should we do?
You can finish up the presentation, then we go into the questions.
Okay, good. Yeah. In other words, each deity had its domain and was characterized by arbitrariness and conflict. There was a battle between the gods. As long as you have a battle between the gods, how are you going to have peace? How are you going to have peace among men if you have a battle between the gods? And therefore, by the way, the gods were also natural forces. In the Jewish view, God was not a natural force among other natural force. God was the creator of nature. And the God that created nature created a world that was organized. It was organized and could be understood, and one could act ethically in it. If you don't have an orderly universe, one cannot act ethically. Because you have to be able to say, if I decide this, I'm going to have this consequence, and so forth. Oh, he says he left the question because his microphone doesn't. Okay, sure, great. We'll try to get to it, okay? Another thing, human beings, according to the biblical view, monotheistic view, are made in and for the divine image. What does that mean, in the divine image? It means that they have something within them that I guess some people metaphorically speak about the spark of the divine, or a soul, really, that enables them to know that they're made in the divine image, as Akiva says. And therefore, they're not only made in the divine image, but as my great teacher, Hans Jonas, says, they're made for the divine image. If we don't stand for God in the world, who will? If we don't introduce God in the world, if we don't change the order of nature to bring about justice and righteousness and peace, who will? Mm-hmm. And as a result, what you have is a new concept of man. Man is a spiritual reality, not just a physical reality. Man does not live by bread alone. Right?
Yeah.
Man lives by human beings, forget man. Women don't live by bread. Okay. I mean, I really think that's very important, because once you say that there's this ideal goal that one should realize, then basically history becomes a reality. In the ancient world, you had no concept of history. In fact, historia in Greek basically means investigation. And really, if you read both Herodotus and Thucydides, their historia, their history, is an investigation as to why there were wars, and we should really learn from them, because it's going to happen all over again, because everything is cyclical. What you have in the Bible is a beginning, a middle, and an end. You have a creation, you have revelation, you have redemption. And just as monotheism affirmed one God and one cosmos, it also means that you now have the possibility of an ideal goal of history. So the ideal of humanity, only through monotheism can the idea of humanity make any sense at all. Otherwise, you've got tribes, you've got nations, and you've got war. And if you have one ideal goal of history, then it's conceivable, if we get our act together, if we take seriously what it means to be a religious person, then perhaps we can bring about a society of justice and peace, which gives human beings their tasks, their responsibilities. And it's a threefold task: for yourself, others, and I would say for God, who is the ground for the order, value, and meaning in the world and in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Jack, very much for these great words. And I think now let's start to open the floor for discussion. And let me ask you the first question. In one of the recent talks, you also said that religion should be the conscience of society, should be the reflection of
and the
society.
voice of humanity, that's correct, yes.
Exactly. What do you think is the role of interreligious dialogue in the cooperation between various religions in the world?
Well, I think that the main role is to find ways in which we can work together to bring. I remember once when we were in Denver with Pope John Paul II. He came to meet with a group of religious people, and it was very late. It was 11 o'clock at night. There was Cardinal O'Connor there, Cardinal Keeler there, a lot of people. And he said something that really stayed with me. He said that we may never be able to get religions to agree theologically. In other words, we have our own, understanding of what is sacred and so forth. But on the basis of our belief in one God, we should be able to agree on a universal ethic so that all human beings can bring about a society of justice and peace. He was very concerned about that, you see.
Mm-hmm.
And what religions can do if they work together is find ways in which they not only say, oh, look at the things that we agree on, look at how wonderful it is that we can talk to one another. We really have to get to the next step, which says, how do we really work together? Now, we have some precedent for that. You had that in the civil rights movement. I remember when I was involved, because I was head of worship for the Reform movement, and people from Martin Luther King's office would call and say, we need some rabbis to come and and sit in Mississippi or in Fort Lauderdale and so forth. So I think the task of interreligious dialogue is to actually find ways in which we can work together. Now, it seems to me there's a prelude here, and that is we have to come clean and be honest about the sort of nasty things that we've been saying about one another. I mean, for example, it's true that the people who engage in interreligious dialogue have a tendency to focus on those things that we all agree on. But there's got to be some way in which, let's say, for example, a religion can say, well, there are certain things that you're saying about me that really I don't recognize myself in that representation. So I've got to be able to tell you as a Christian or a Muslim or a Buddhist or whatever, that your description of me, especially if it's canonical, is something that doesn't really describe it. Let's contextualize it. Let's redefine it. Let's retranslate it. And the interesting thing is, the moment you contextualize it, most of it is gone. Mm-hmm. See, it's a false way of affirming certain things. Here, I like what the Quran says in Surah 5, where it says that religion should compete in virtue. Let's see who is the most virtuous, who is the one that can do the most for humanity. That makes sense to me.
Yeah, actually, here we have a lot of students from the Ukrainian Catholic University, and we are teaching, we are having the course on Nostra Aetate. Now, as a Jewish rabbi, what would you say? Did the Catholic Church in 1965 succeed in opening the door to interreligious dialogue? Did they have the correct representation of Judaism in Nostra Aetate? Because, I mean, the paragraph 4 of Nostra Aetate is the biggest paragraph that is dedicated to all of the religions. So what's your reaction to Nostra Aetate? And do you think if the Church were to write another Nostra Aetate now, what should be there in the document that was missing in Nostra Aetate in 1965?
Well, I think that the Nostra Aetate was a revolution, because it was the first time ever, and this was the genius of John the 23rd. And I had one of the great experiences of my life in 1960 when I had an audience with John the 23rd. It was very few of us. And basically, he came up with this idea that the only way that I can be true to my faith and true to yours, I can only be true to my faith by telling the truth about how my faith treated your faith. And that's why when Jules Isaac went to him in June, I think, of 1960, I think I saw him before Jules Isaac saw him. I think I saw him in March. And Jules Isaac says, what do you do with all these teachings of contempt? Don't deal with that. And of course, he did that, in the Good Friday liturgy, where he took out perfidious Jews. And that was the beginning where and then you have the categorical statement in Nostra Aetate that you cannot come to any kind of anti-Judaism or anti-Semitism from the New Testament. And therefore, we should be studying it together to find ways of making sense out of it. I think that was a great step forward.
Okay.
Now, I think that began with John the 23rd. It continued with the next popes, and especially with John Paul II when Cardinal Cassidy came to Prague. I wrote the Prague Agreement and said we ask forgiveness of the Jews for acts of anti-Judaism. In other words, we ask forgiveness for what we've done. Now, I think that is amazing. I wish that every religion would do that. So, we may have said things. Look, I remember when I was young, And I used to go to synagogue, and I would hear rabbis telling me how wonderful Judaism is and how terrible Christianity is. I finally said, I better look into it on my own and see what really Christianity is. Oh, so I decided I would go and listen to a preacher. I would go and listen to an Episcopal or a Catholic. And here I heard wonderful lectures on how wonderful Christianity was and how terrible Judaism is. Why does it have to be, I have to be good at your expense? Can't we both be good in our own way? And that's basically what I tried to say in my discourse. So you might want to send them my discourse. So when I gave you a doctor.
Yeah, I will. And actually, we have some more people who joined us today, so you'll get the article of Rabbi Jack later today. Now, we have questions already in the chat box. The first one is from Hanna Vasilevska. The question is, can the current situation with the outbreak bring more attention to those people who lack the basic resources, such as water, for example?
Yes, I think, well, here again, it's a matter of whether we're going to act either ethically, compassionately, or we're going to act selfishly. I mean, are we going to simply say the most important thing is I'm going to cut out the water because they haven't paid their bill, even though they've lost their job, and even though they don't have a nickel? Or are we going to say, yes, you can continue to have the water, and hopefully we will find ways in which you can eventually pay it? That's the problem. You can't, and the other thing, if you're going to have a bailout, you can't have a bailout that simply supports the businesses. I mean, for example, in 2008, you had 10,000 homes going in foreclosure a day. So they actually supported the banks. Since the banks weren't being paid, they gave a loan to the banks. Mm-hmm. Well, why didn't they just give the money to the people who were in the house to pay the banks? I mean, there's a wise way of doing this and a not so wise way of doing this. I think the real question, it seems to me, is if we're going to be concerned about our fellow humans, we can't, on the one hand, on Sunday, go to church, or on Saturday, go to synagogue and talk about how much we love our fellow human being, and then on Monday, cut water off.
Yeah, truly, monotheism, it has ethical implication. Otherwise, without that.
Okay, so if it does have ethical implications, then you have to say that there are certain limits to the pursuit of profit. We have to have some safeguards, like a safety net, so that people don't find themselves in the kind of a situation where they either starve or get sick and die, or have to steal.
Right. Well, we have another question from Maria Hopolo. How can we address, I guess, as religious or interreligious people, how we can address the problem of refugees, poverty, war, and environmental refugees?
Well, here I think what we have to do is see the connection. You can't say, what are we going to do with these refugees from Iraq, as if the war in Iraq had nothing to do with it. You can't keep bombing people so that they have to leave their homes and then say, well, what are we going to do with these refugees? Come on now, let's open our eyes to the reality. And the solution, it seems to me, is to say that you have a worldwide consortium of nations that put aside the best thinking and a good deal of money to resettle these refugees. We're trying to do something through the CIU, the Center for Interreligious Understanding. We have taken on the task, and we've had some success with that. What do you do with all these refugees that had to leave their universities, their schools? Isn't there some way, wherever they are, that we can provide schooling for them? We've got 100 Catholic universities involved, and other universities involved in providing free training and education. I mean, there's an example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we have about 12 more minutes or 13 more minutes. If anybody wants to...
Doesn't it bother you to think that in the United States we have no hesitation to spend $1 billion to get money to run a campaign, but we don't have money to give water to people who have nothing to drink?
Yeah, it's scandalous. It's scandalous, and
So
especially now with
why don't we tell the truth? That's
with the outbreak of the coronavirus.
Your motto is seek the truth, and the truth will set you free. What truth are we talking about? Right? What is the truth?
Exactly. Yeah, let's see if anybody else has questions. You can just raise your hand and we can unmute you if you want, Brian. Okay, Brian is the first one. Go ahead. We cannot hear you, Brian.
This is Amanda's asking a question. Did you see that? Amanda.
Okay, yes, she's written, you see it? Is the Christian concept of Trinity contrary to monotheism for Jewish?
Yes. I would say that it's something that in the form in which it is presented in Christianity, which is through the doctrine of incarnation, that I think is difficult from a Jewish perspective. The idea that you have the Shekhinah, which is the presence of God, you have ways of speaking about God's actions as being different actions. But basic Jewish monotheism is opposed to any plurality in God.
Yeah, I think when you mentioned that the theological questions are really, really difficult because religions cannot agree theologically. But when we go to the social action, this is where the strength of interreligious dialogue.
Yeah, it's a question of the consequences of our beliefs. Mm-hmm. And especially the commitment that we make to these beliefs. You know, and you know, the thing that I find most important in everything that I've had to say so far today, which perhaps I haven't said it properly enough, is that every human being is fragile. Every human being is vulnerable. Every human being needs help. There is no self-sufficient human being. And if we understand that, and we can be put in touch with our own precariousness, our own finiteness, our own vulnerability, then we can somehow see that it's not just me that is vulnerable, everybody is. So we have to do what we can to help one another. When Jesus said love one another, he was telling the truth. But how are you going to love someone if you know that you're denying them water so that they can't drink?
Brian, did you have a question? You can speak up. We cannot hear you.
Emily, how are you?
I'm good. Rabbi Jack, I have a question, actually. Can you hear me?
Sure.
Okay, so monotheism means there's one God, right? In Judaism, there's one God.
One unique God, unique God. Unique is more important than one.
Okay. So then if, you know, Christians and Muslims are also worshiping one God. So in Judaism, does that mean, because if there's only one God, that we are all worshiping the same God?
Yes.
Okay.
But we conceptualize them differently.
So the common Jewish interpretation.
There's only one God. The question is, how do we describe this one God? Mm-hmm. And a lot of that has to do with our history. You see, what connections do we put this God? But I would say there are foundational connections that all three religions have with respect to this one God, and that is that this one God is concerned about the way human beings act and the way the human beings are treated. All three religions affirm that. Whatever they may, however they may, whether it's a Trinity or a radical monotheism, as it is in Islam and as it is in Judaism, or Trinitarian monotheism, the real issue is, do we put God as the one who's going to judge us, or are we going to judge God and say, well, we do whatever we want? You know, let me just tell you one thing. Have you ever thought about looking at a mirror? And why do you look at a mirror? You look at a mirror to see, well, have I got the right kind of shirt? Have I got the right kind of tie? Is my hair combed? You know, did I put on the proper lipstick and all that? But that's not what a mirror should be. When we look at a mirror, we ask ourselves the following questions. Have I embodied the virtues? Have I been compassionate? Look at yourself. Have I been just? Have I been humble? Have I really stood up for what God demands of me? That's the question. That's what our mirror should embody for us, you see? Or when God said to, where is your brother? And Cain says, am I my brother's keeper? That's your problem, not mine. Not true. We are our brother's keeper. Now, all three religions on one form or 11, both Judaism and Islam, for instance, says if you destroy one life, it's as if you destroyed an entire world. And if you save one life, it's as if you save an entire. Each individual counts. That's foundational to monotheism. That's the point.
Thank you. Brian, can you try again now? Still cannot hear you, Brian. Now, we had a question from Urmi. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the idea of uniqueness that you just mentioned?
Yes, because I've only ever heard of, the stress on the oneness of a certain God in the context of monotheism. But tell me more about the uniqueness bit of it.
Uniqueness in the sense that there's no other reality like God's reality.
Okay.
And in what sense? I can tell you in what sense. In that every other reality comes to be and passes away. See, whereas God doesn't come into being and pass away. God does not have a cause. Mm-hmm. See, everything else that comes into being is caused. We all, there was a time when I didn't exist, and there's going to be a time when I don't exist. That's true of you too. That's not true of God. Yeah. Unique in the sense that no other being is like God.
Okay. Got it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Yes, Marta Homutenko. Go ahead. Let me unmute you. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to unmute myself. But so it's a bit of a theological question, but still it's a kind of more interreligious. So I'm referring to Emily's question where you said that actually when we accept monotheistic religion, from the point of view of Judaism, it means that we actually worship one same unique God, but from like different perceptions of it. Right. So what actually, from the perception of Judaism then, is the importance of belonging to one religion? So, I mean, let me set an example. From the history of Catholic Church, I can speak as a Christian. We know that in the Middle Ages, it went too far saying that there is no salvation outside of the church. Right. So when we are claiming that actually people from different religions worship the same God just in different ways, so it does mean that there are different ways to worship the same God. So what actually the importance of belonging to specifically to Judaism or specifically to Christianity from the perspective?
That's a very good question. What's your name? I'm sorry.
Marta.
Very good. Very nice. Thank you. Here's the point, and that is that in Judaism, you don't have to be Jewish to be saved. You don't have to be Jewish. There's an ancient text, very ancient, 2,000 years old, that says the righteous of all human beings have a place in the world to come. In other words, if you lead an ethical life and in terms of your best judgment, you're acting morally, that's all that can be demanded of you. You see? Now, you shouldn't be an idolater. You shouldn't go out worshiping idols, because what that means is you're basically worshiping something you can manipulate or you use to manipulate for your own private needs. But basically, now it's interesting that it took the new catechism of the Catholic Church to actually say the same thing. There's a section in the catechism that says, is there salvation outside of the church? And the answer is yes. As long as you lead a righteous life and in your own self-understanding, you're acting honestly and honorably, there is salvation. That's a change from, in the United States, what was the Baltimore Catechism. The Baltimore Catechism, and that's not that old, basically reaffirms what you were saying, that there is no salvation outside of the Catholic Church. But even let's assume that you didn't change that. And people say, okay, Jews are not saved, Muslims are not saved, Hindus are not saved, Buddhists are not saved, and all the rest are not saved. Okay. Doesn't that mean that one should try to still find ways of working together to bring about peace? Being saved is a very private thing. It's a question of whether I somehow will achieve immortality. How does that have to deal with the way we live in this life? Right? Does that mean that you have to persecute people because they don't believe? The point I was making before about, looking at the dark side of exclusivism. Yes, I believe in exclusivism. Tara, send them my paper, okay?
I will.
I think what we have to do is change the negative elements of exclusivism. There was somebody else who asked a question about women. I don't know who it was.
Yeah, they're all.
Thank you for your question. I'm grateful to you. You asked a really good question. Thank you.
Yes, Swati asked the question about the role of women in imparting monotheism, in upbringing the children.
The role of women in monotheism?
Yeah.
I gave a talk on women, which I'll send to you. You can send to everybody. But I think that the one thing that's interesting about the Bible is how the significant role of women that you have in the Bible. The very fact that you have Esther and Ruth, two books named by two women who are heroes. And at the last book of the last chapter of Proverbs, it talks about a courageous woman. And if you look at the 31st chapter of Proverbs and see what she does is amazing. But by and large, women are seen in the Bible as taking a very significant part in bringing about the future of Judaism. I mean, I can give you the specific examples, but keep in mind that it was a patriarchal society. And a patriarchal society meant that women had not that many rights, except that women slaves were treated like male slaves. Women, by the way, in the rabbinic period, were given a certificate of marriage, so that a ketubah, which is a writing, so that a man couldn't simply divorce at will. If he divorced them, he had to give them a substantial amount of money. And that protected women. Thirdly, you had universal education, so that the women in the ancient world were the only, Jewish women were the only women that actually learned how to read and write, because they had to be able to follow the Torah. Fourthly, they had to be able to run a household, which means they have to clean everything. They have to know how to do that. They have to be able to take care of children. So women were given a great deal, not as much as I would like. And one of the great glories that I've lived long enough to experience the real birth of women's rights and women's activities. So that I see all these students of mine that are women. I see one right in front of me, Emily, and others who really have taken hold and have said, we're going to make a place for ourselves in the world. And I say, well, right on, So I'm very, very pleased that at least finally, and we have women rabbis, by the way, and cantors.
There are more women on this webinar than men, actually.
Yeah, there are more women. I'm very happy to let them do it.
Well, Brian, let's give it another try. Does your microphone work?
I think so. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good.
Okay, good. All right. So in your 10 rules for Judaism, or I don't know if you said rules precisely.
Principles.
But, 10 principles of Judaism. You said that Judaism is constantly struggling and, or not struggling, learning. It's constantly learning. It's constantly,
Yes.
There's constantly an enrichment to this.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned that reason and the scriptures will both take you to the same place. So if someone is rational and someone is following their conscience, they'll come to the same conclusion that the Bible comes to. And I first of all, I thought of the Muslim philosophers Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd when I read that. And these philosophers, they got in some trouble amongst their contemporaries with Al-Ghazali,
Right.
For saying that they could approach it without the Quran, or the Quran was the same as reason, and that the two are one and the same. And I was wondering if, in your perspective, if there's still a need to use Scripture, is there still a reliance on Scripture in the traditional sense of like this is the holy book, or is it a text that is merely one holy book that leads to all sorts of truth? And since the idea is constantly interacting with other truths, that we're not limiting ourselves to just the book, which makes sense. No one should limit themselves to just one book if they want to truly learn. But is there still a reliance on the Scriptures as such? Is what I'm asking, I guess. Yeah, in the traditional idea of relying on a Scripture as the holy book.
You're asking a very difficult question, a profound question. And I don't think there's any easy answer, because what they meant, what the medieval philosophers meant by reason is very different from what we mean by reason today. You see, the medievalists believed that reason was an organ. They didn't even use the word reason. They used the word intellect. And it was that faculty of the mind that leads to truth. And therefore, the truth that this faculty of the mind leads to cannot be different in any way than the truth of the Bible, because they started with the assumption that there's one truth. So that what you arrive at through reason and what you arrive at through revelation ultimately has to be the same. So that Maimonides, for example, would even go so far as to take the distinction that was made between rational and dogmatic commandments and say, no, they're all rational. And so the point is, let's try to give. So that's a somewhat different question that would arise today when nobody views reason in that sense. Today, reason is used primarily as a method by which we investigate something, or the way we organize our experience and so forth. And in that sense, no one today would argue that somehow, just by sheer reason, you would come to, let's say, one God, or the idea that all human beings basically are made in the divine image, or that somehow we have to do everything we can to go do away with war. Now, if a person has any sense, they certainly would argue you have to do away with war. But the very fact that anyone can even imagine the possibility of there being peace, this was inconceivable without monotheism. You can't even think of it, because in the ancient world, nobody thought that way. It took Isaiah and Micah to say, we've got to have peace. Their idea of peace was basically a truce. That's all peace was. And in fact, when they looked at the Pacific Ocean, who was it? Vasco da Gama, who saw the Pacific Ocean. He says it's peaceful. Why? Because it was tranquil. Peace is, there was that famous statement that say they destroy the place and they go into a city, the Romans, they destroy everything, they kill everyone, and they say, now there's peace. You see what I'm saying?
I think so. It's with our understanding of God that we come to the understanding that humanity has value, and then we come to the conclusion that we must respect each other.
The idea of humanity
comes from
Only
God.
God who creates the world and human beings has a concept of humanity. If you believe that there are tribes and there are nations, and these are constantly at war, then my tribe and my nation is superior to yours, and I've got to destroy you. So the very concept of humanity is what I'm talking about.
And God.
And that requires monotheism.
Okay. Because the dignity, image, and likeness of God.
Why would you even talk about someone having dignity? Why don't I take people, if they're willing to be my slaves, let them be my slaves? Why not? Because it's fundamentally wrong with a person feeling good at the expense of somebody else. There's something really radically wrong with that. That's what my definition of idolatry. Namely, that you feel good at somebody else's expense. Maybe that's really what we have to start with. That's that mirror that I'm talking about. You look at the mirror and say, well, have I done things that I'm ashamed of? Have I done things that are not worthy of who I claim to be? To myself. That's the mirror. Not if I got the right tie on.
Yeah, I think talking about time, we have a few more minutes. So if we have time for one or two more questions. Maxim, I see your hand. Go ahead, unmute yourself, please.
Hello, thank you for this talk. I have some question more social theme. As I saw, like the sociality, there's some paradox here that people who are not religious, and of course not Monotheism, they can behave themselves as immortal. So, more light-hearted. So, I'm the creation. Like the Christianity have this, the principle that about the immortality of the soul. Yes, but people who are not religious, they behave themselves. So they are like, can you maybe something talk about that? Because it is very strange, because they are not. We are not immortal. Yes, our body are not, of course. Right. So this is very strange. That maybe because of this is the war. Yes, because people think that I will do everything I want to, and I will have anything after that.
I don't think I understand you.
I think let me just paraphrase it. Some evil people who don't have any religion, so in this life they behave as they want to. So how do we as religious people respond to this? Seeing those people who don't have any religion and they do whatever they want, they behave evilly. Is this correct, Maxim?
Like that, and also about the paradox. Yes, that people who don't really believe in any God, all are maybe agnostics. Yes, so they behave themselves like they are immortal.
Immortal.
Yes, immortal, yes.
Well, let me start with your first question, and that is, I would feel pity and a great deal of sorrow for these people, because they've had this opportunity to live their life and have missed what being, in other words, by really living, what really living means. Because if you can't really genuinely love another person, if you can't have what I would call pure love for someone or something, I think you've gone through life. You may have everything in the world, but you really miss the opportunity of being a fully human person. And so my feeling about, look, the unhappiest people I've ever known were billionaires. I've known a number of billionaires. See, I've had congregations, very large congregations, with very wealthy people. I'm talking about billionaires. I've never met more miserable people than billionaires. And I'll tell you why. Because they put all their eggs in the basket of making money. Then they got the money, and they found that they're not any happier. And the one thing, and that didn't work out. So what are they left with? So then they start looking at this and that and the next thing. And on the other hand, you have people who, I think that the reality has a lot to do with the way we've been brought up, the values we've been given, the habits. Keep in mind, habit is the greatest tyrant. The habits that we live by will determine that. Now, as far as immortality is concerned, no one really knows for sure. If we knew for sure that we were going to act in a certain way and be immortal, then there wouldn't be any real reason not to act that way. It's only because we really don't know that we have to do it because it's right, not because we're going to be immortal. You see? That's the point.
Yeah, I think we have another question.
Ask another question.
Maria Hupalo, yes.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm sorry. I have no web camera on my computer, so you will be just hearing me.
Your voice is wonderful. We don't need to see you; just hear you.
Oh, thank you. I would like to ask some question, because in Ukraine, especially, but I think it's in the world in general, Christians, and I think not only Christians, face the challenge of how to live our liturgical life without going to the temple, yes, to the church. And I was thinking about Jewish experience after the destroy of the Second Temple, when Jews had to rethink the whole idea, how they serve God, how they live their liturgical life. It was a great pain and struggle for them. Maybe you can say
Well,
something how
very
this
good.
experience can be useful
Yeah.
for
Yes.
modern
Yes.
times.
No, very good. I think that the way that the Jewish people tried to overcome that was before the temple was destroyed to set up the synagogue. But they had some kind of a precedent for that. Not that they had a synagogue after the destruction of the first temple, but for at least 50 to 70 years, they went without a temple. So you had a lot of psalms that were written during that period, and you find them in the Psalm book. But they actually developed readings of scriptures. And by developing readings of scriptures, Johnny, take this, will you? Johnny. Oh, no, but he talks Italian. Hold on 1 second. In other words, they didn't have a temple for a while, and that period of not having a temple forced them to try to find. But I would go even further. I would say that prayer does not need a temple. And prayer doesn't even need a church. What really, in prayer, what happens in prayer? Two things. One, in prayer, the God of the universe becomes my God. God becomes my individual God. And secondly, in prayer, I can open myself fully and completely and honestly before God. I can be completely and absolutely honest. Now that you can do at home. In fact, you notice what Jesus says. Jesus says, go on your bed, right? He didn't say go to the synagogue. He said, go on your bed and meditate in your heart.
Well, Rabbi Jack and everybody, I think we are out of time now. We would like to thank you very, very much, Rabbi Jack, for this wonderful dialogue conversation that you had for us.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, we really hope that we in the near future will be able to have more webinars like this.
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you very much, and to everybody, we'll send you materials to your email. Keep an eye on updates.
Okay, good. Listen, Ataras.
Yes.
Fatima, who's Fatima? Fatima wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, Fatima, yes, go ahead.
No, I said thank you.
Oh, okay, thank you. Yes, thank you for joining, Fatima. Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. God bless you.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Have a nice day, everybody.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful.
Thank you, Rabbi Jack.